taking you through a class about how you can create a low-waste kitchen at home. In front of me, I have a bowl of food items that you might commonly have at home, and we're going to take all of these items and transform them so that there's zero waste at the end. I have broccoli, beets, cucumbers, celery, some herbs, garlic, lemons, onions, apples, canned beans, and some stale bread. And all of the techniques that we're going to talk about today are applicable to all kinds of foods, so you can take this and adapt it for what you have in your home kitchen. Getting started, we're going to talk a little bit about proper food storage. So when you're unpacking your groceries, or if you come to the Pacific Pantry and you're wondering where to put your food, you're going to think about it in 3 different categories. Cold storage, room temperature storage with air, or room temperature storage without access to air. All of these items can be stored at room temperature, but they will have longer longevity if they're in the fridge. You're going to extend their life by quite a bit if you put them in the fridge. Cooling food down will slow the decay and decomposition process. You can utilize your fridge, or even better, your freezer as well, and that's going to give you a couple of months that you can use some of these items. There are 3 main things to remember when maximizing your food and trying to make it stretch as far as it can. The first is to store it properly. The second is to use as much of the food item as possible. And 3, you can learn how to preserve and put food by so that it can last for months and months at a time. All of this produce here was once a beautiful living plant in the soil, but as soon as it's been harvested and you're taking it home, decay is inevitable. And there are 2 main things that can happen. One is actual decay, and so we want to prevent mold and yeast and fungus and anything that might be growing on it. We want to prevent that from happening. But the other thing that can happen is food can go stale as well. So I have this bread in front of me, and it's kind of tough and it's stale, and that's because the water has evaporated from it. And so this has gone pretty hard. And so when you bring your food home, it's really important to think about how quickly you're going to be able to use something. You're going to use it very quickly. You don't need to stress too much about storing it, other than making sure it goes in the fridge if it needs to or not. But if you're going to be using it a little bit longer, a little bit further out, there are some techniques you can do to slow any of that microbial growth, or to make sure that that food stays properly hydrated. So if I were in my home, I probably wouldn't use all of this cilantro all in one go. Maybe I'm making some tacos or some salsa, and I'm going to use half of it, but I'm probably not going to use all of it at once. The thing that I'm worried about with this is it getting really dehydrated. So the way I'm going to store it is actually by getting a jar, filling it up with some water, and storing my herbs in that jar so that I prevent them from getting wilty and flat before I'm ready to finish using them, and that will definitely help them last a lot longer. You can do the same thing with carrots and celery, or anything else that might get a little bit wilty before it gets moldy or anything like that. And so for my bread, that's also gone a little bit stale. I obviously can't submerge it in water, but a really good way to rehydrate this so that it's delicious and lovely to eat is I'm actually going to dampen a paper towel and wrap it around it, and then if I want to eat it right away, you just put it in the microwave, and that water will rehydrate the bread very quickly, or I can leave it out for an hour or 2, and then that bread will be ready for me to eat a little bit later. And so if I put this in the microwave for 10 to 20 seconds, this is going to be as good as new. watch our video on foodrescuedelmart.org, or you can visit us on Facebook and watch that video. So now let's talk about how you can stretch your food and make it go farther than you ever thought possible. There are some parts of food that we're really used to just throwing away. So I'm holding some broccoli here, and a lot of times if you're cooking a recipe, you might just eat the flowers of the broccoli. You might just eat this part right here. And you might leave behind the stem. Maybe you just grew up doing that. Maybe the recipe didn't call for it. But you might just toss the rest of this away. Or I have some celery here, and it's really common for all of the leaves to be torn off and to throw those away. But the truth is, you don't have to throw away a lot of these pieces. We're just used to doing it for a whole number of reasons. So it's always really important to ask and to look up if these pieces are edible or not. In very few cases, parts of foods are discarded because they aren't safe for people to eat, but most of the time they are, and we toss them away just out of habit. So all of these leaves should definitely be saved, and if you are cooking with broccoli, keep the stems as well and cook those up. So I'm going to top up these stalks. I'm going to keep them separate from the florets, but I am going to use these in a recipe a little bit later. So that came apart really easily, and see how much of that might have gotten thrown away. It's almost a third of the weight of that vegetable, and we're definitely going to keep it. One part might be a little bit more bitter in flavor, or it might be tougher in texture. Those are the two biggest reasons that it might be less desirable than the other part. And we can overcome that by cooking it just a little bit differently. And so some techniques like blanching will help soften tough texture, and techniques like roasting or sauteing will really help counteract the bitter flavor and actually make this really delicious to eat all on its own. So I'm just going to keep these a little bit separate. And I am going to set these aside for a recipe that we're going to use a little bit later. So now I'm going to work on my celery. And what I'm doing here as I prep each ingredient that I'm going to cook with, I am thinking about multiple recipes at once. I might be thinking a day ahead or even 2 or 3 days ahead, so that I can really make sure I'm stretching each of these items as far as it can possibly go, and I'm using all of it, even if I'm not using it all at once. So if I'm making an after-school snack for somebody, we're going to make some ants on a log. I might not use this whole bunch, and I'm definitely not going to use these leaves right away. And so one technique that is really, really, really helpful is to keep a stock bag. And so I take a Ziploc bag just like this, and I label it stock scraps and the day that I started it. That way I know the oldest ingredient that's in this bag. And every time I'm chopping vegetables or peeling vegetables or doing anything, I save all of the leftover pieces, and I put them in this bag, and then I put it in the freezer. And I might only have a few pieces at once, but eventually I'll have enough scraps in here that I will be able to make my own stock from scratch. And keeping it in the freezer means that it's not going to go bad before I'm ready to do that. So let's prep our celery. And you can see, especially as we get to the middle, these are pieces that I'm probably not going to want to eat raw, but I definitely want to keep all of this and use it. So I'll take that last piece, and then the rest of this, I'm going to pull all the leaves off, and I'm going to chop all this down for our stock bag. And you can see the then I'm also keeping the white part of this vegetable as well. I'm trying to take it all the way down as far as I can to the end of that stalk. So that will be our only leftover. Oops. And with celery leaves in particular, they make a really, really, really great stock broth all on their own, especially for mussels. So if you like any sort of seafood, celery leaves are absolutely delicious. A lot of times when we hear the word food waste, we think scraps, or we think it might have a negative connotation. We might think that it's something we don't want anymore. It has the word waste in it. But with celery in particular, it really highlights just how subjective it is. In many cultures, actually, the leaves are the desirable part, and the stalk is the part you would end up throwing away. It's completely reversed of what we're used to in the US. So there really is no absolute science to any of this. It's all subjective. And if you take away anything from this video, it's just reframing how you think about your food and learning to ask questions and do a little bit of research to see, is this edible, and what can I do to make it so that it tastes really good. So you can see that's actually quite a bit. So I've got a really great start to stock. It could probably seem something just of this alone. But I'm going to keep it because later I'm going to put some other things in this. And so if I were home, I would just put this right in the freezer, and I would have all of these to make my snack. I'm also just going to chop up these ends. And so from that whole bunch of celery, the only thing that I'm going to put in the compost is this little piece right here. So the next item in our basket that we're going to work on is these beets. So you can see that this is a very large food item. Beets that we're going to roast are down here with our broccoli. But all of this stem and green leaves we might be used to throwing away. And this is another really good example of something that does not have to be thrown away, and we can eat it. But we want to make it taste really good because these greens can be a little bit bitter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just separate those two parts for my two different recipes. Beets that we'll set aside to use a little bit later. But we are going to use these greens. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to make a beet green pesto. I've made this a number of times and it's absolutely delicious. You can do the same thing with carrot greens or any root vegetable that has a really hearty green part on top. Just to make sure, do a little bit of research to make sure it's edible, but almost all of them are. So we're going to chop all of this up, and we're going to use some other strong flavors to help balance out the little bit of extra bitterness that these greens have. So we're going to use a lot of lemon, a lot of garlic, some delicious olive oil, and some cheese, and even some walnuts to help balance all of those flavors out and make a really delicious pesto. So I'm going to be including these stalks as well. You can use those for a different recipe if you want, but I really like them in this dip recipe. It will make our dip look a little bit more purple than green, but I assure you it's going to taste absolutely delicious. beet greens here in my blender and save these beets for my second recipe, but I'm going to keep adding to my pesto. So I'm going to take lemons next. Now with lemons, if you want to get more of that juice out, you can roll them on a table, and that will help maximize everything that you're able to juice out of it. So I'm thinking about this recipe and I want lemon juice, but I have all of this peel that I would probably throw away. And lemon zest is really, really great for baking, it's good for cooking, it's good for a whole variety of reasons. So instead of throwing this away and then buying a new lemon later when I need lemon zest, I'm going to zest it first, and I'm going to freeze that, and then I'm going to juice this for the recipe that I'm using right now. And if you don't have a zester at home, that's totally fine. You can also use a vegetable peeler like I'm going to use today, and we'll peel this lemon to save the rinds for later. So now I've got my lemon all peeled, and all the peels I'm going to save for later. Again, it is always really important to label and date anything that you're going to put away for a later time. You always want to know how old something is and what exactly it is. So I labeled my bag, and when I'm done filling this up, I'm going to put it in the freezer. So now to finish this recipe up, I'm going to add some garlic, and then I'm also going to add some cheese and some walnuts. With the garlic, just like our celery, I'm going to save all of the peels, and I'm going to add it to our stock scraps bag. I like adding a lot of garlic to this recipe just because those greens have a pretty big flavor, so I'm going to try to balance it with a matching strong garlic flavor. So now I'm going to add some oil, cheese, and walnuts to this, and I'm going to blend it all up, and it's going to be done. And at the end, we'll have this beautiful, beautiful, brightly colored, but delicious pesto. And if you like, I personally do really like saving my lemons for stock, just because I like a really citrusy broth, but you don't have to do that. I just do. So now we're left actually with the rest of our beets, and I want to talk about peeling vegetables. A lot of times this is something we may be used to, or a recipe might tell us to do that. Peel your beets, peel some carrots, but you really don't have to. And it's a great way to preserve nutrients and lower your waste if you keep them on. That said, you probably don't want to be eating a whole bunch of dirt, so the best way to prepare these beets for roasting is just to make sure you wash and scrub them really, really well. But you can always keep the skins on, and that's true of apples and carrots and beets and just about roast them with our broccoli stalks, actually. So I'm going to drizzle all of these with some olive oil and season them with some salt and pepper, and I'm going to roast them and have a beautiful roasted vegetable side for dinner tonight. I want to show you one more way that you can stretch a very commonly purchased food item even farther than you may have ever thought you could before. And that item is actually garbanzo beans. This will work for other types of canned beans as well, but I do find that the garbanzo works best, and I often have this in my pantry. So when you open a can of beans to cook with it, they are packaged in liquid, and that liquid can actually be used as a replacement for eggs in baking. So instead of pouring and straining this liquid out and pouring it down the sink or throwing it away, I'm actually going to strain these beans and catch all of the liquid into a bowl and show you what you can do with it. This bowl. So you can see that it's submerged in all of this liquid, and that can be saved. I'm actually going to use the top just strain it for me. The amount of liquid in each can is going to be different. It will vary, but if you are going to be saving this bean water to bake with, about 3 tablespoons is the equivalent of 1 egg. You can use it just as is if your recipe calls just for eggs and they're not whipped. You can use this as is, but for more stability and for more of a cakey texture, if you're going to be using it in that way, you can add 2 tablespoons of sugar, and then you can whip it until it's foamy, and that will almost act like a meringue. I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of sugar to this mixture because I want to show you what it looks like when this gets foamy. And then I'm going to use a whisk, and if you have an electric mixer at home, even better. As you can see, as I'm mixing it, it's already starting to turn frothy. So if you were reading a recipe that said you needed to use eggs that were lightly whipped or broken, this would be the good stage to stop whipping the bean water. But if you had a recipe that called for egg whites that needed to be whipped until it was meringue and had peaks, we can do that with this, and we'll keep going. At this consistency, you can do 99% of the baking that you would want to do. Really, the only reason you would need to continue farther is if you were making meringues. But as you can see, we've got some light peaks forming. We're starting to get some structure, and you could keep going as far as you liked. You can use this for savory or sweet baking. As you can see, we did put a little bit of sugar into this mixture, and that just helps create the actual structure, and it won't have a huge impact on the taste. So you can do any sort of savory or sweet baking that you would like. But this is a really great, great thing you can do to make this can of beans just go even longer, and then when you're out of eggs one day, you can use this. To save it for later, if you're not going to use it right away, before whipping it and foaming it, you can pour it into a plastic container, and you can actually put that in the freezer until you're ready to use it, and then whip it right before you're ready to bake with it. So I'm going to pour these beans out and roast them in the oven alongside our vegetables from earlier, and set this aside for some baking that I'll do later on today. at this point you could put some salt and pepper on as well, but I'm going to leave these plain to be dressed later. So now that we have all of our menu cooking, we have stretched all of our produce as far as it can go, creating very little waste. And now I'm going to show you 3 different ways of preserving food so that it can last for weeks or even months. And so we are going to go through 3 different steps. I'm going to show you how to make a quick pickle, I'm going to show you how to make a lacto-fermented pickle, and then I'm going to show you how to dehydrate food to put by for later. Let's start with our quick pickles. We're going to make some quick pickled onions. And so I'm going to take my 2 onions from our basket, and just like with some of our other produce, I'm going to save these skins and put them in our stock bag. So I'm going to slice these up really thin. Stock scraps bag is starting to get pretty full. So if I were doing all of this cooking, you'd probably be pretty ready to make some soup soon. But we're doing a lot all at once. I'm going to keep all of that. For my quick pickles, I'm just going to use it in this little deli container. Because it's really not going to expand or anything, I'm just going to be pouring vinegar into it. A container like this will do just fine. But at home, you can use a mason jar, you can use a leftover container that you've washed out from something else you've purchased. It's always good to reuse. But with quick pickles, the container doesn't really matter. We just need to submerge the item that we're pickling. So I'm going to put all of these onions into my container. And it looks like I'll probably be able to fit about 1 onion per pint-sized container like this, so I'll do the second one after. Trying to get all of these to fit in one, but really we need enough space for our vinegar to fully cover all of our onions. So I am using this pre-made pickling vinegar to make these pickles today, but you don't need to go out and buy this. If you at home want to make your own pickling brine, you can use water, white vinegar, and pickling salt and any other spices that you might want to add. The important thing for pickling is that you do want to make sure you're using non-iodized pickling salt. Most table salt has been supplemented with iodine, which is a really good nutrient addition to the salt that we put every day on our food, but it can leave a residue when you're making pickles, so you want to make sure that you're using non-iodized or pickling salt. So I'm just going to pour this over and submerge all of the onions that I have and make sure that it's covered. If I would. Just go right like. And that's perfectly acceptable. You don't need to entirely fill your container when you're making quick pickles. Now the reason this is considered food preservation is because the vinegar, the pH of the vinegar, and the salt both are going to counteract any sort of microbial growth on these pickles. So it's going to protect these onions and make sure that these last for a few weeks, if not a month or more. So we do want to keep these in the refrigerator. There is no lacto-fermentation going on, so you wouldn't want to put them immediately into your cupboard. You want to make sure that they are cold and that they are sealed. But it's a great way to extend the life of your onions, especially if you've only had to use half of one for a recipe. You can just quick pickle the rest and have them on hand for quite a long time afterwards. So now that we've done our quick pickled onions, I'm going to show you how to lacto-ferment cucumbers. You can do this with all kinds of vegetables. I'm going to show you how to do it with cucumbers today. And there's a really great benefit to doing this instead of quick pickles because it makes your food last even longer, and it does not need to be refrigerated. So the fermentation is actually going to prevent any kind of unwanted bacteria or other microbes to grow, and it will preserve your food for a very long time. Like our quick pickles, I am going to use our pre-made pickling mix. Your recipe needs to be a little bit more specific for lacto-fermented pickles, so I would definitely recommend getting a book or looking up online the exact recipe that you're going to use, because the amount of salt is going to directly impact whether or not the fermentation can happen correctly or not. But again, I'm just going to use this pre-made one. And for lacto-fermented pickles, instead of just pouring it right on our vegetable, in this case cucumbers, I'm actually going to bring this vinegar up to a gentle boil before I put it into the jar. So I'm going to get that going, and then we'll be able to cut up the cucumbers and get them ready. So as that gets heating up, I'm going to move over here and start getting my cucumbers ready. If you had some cucumbers that were a little bit mushy or not quite as fresh and perfect as these ones are, you can rinse them in an ice water bath, and that is going to help them become really crispy, crunchy pickles. I am just going to slice off this end too. This will help keep them crunchy, but I'm trying to keep that cut really minimal as we're thinking about our waste. You can cut cucumbers into spears, or you can slice them up into discs. The shape doesn't matter. That's entirely your preference. I'm going to make sliced disc pickles today. This is a great time to talk about knife safety as well. If you don't feel like you're very stable as you're cutting, or if your knife is a little bit more dull, you can make this an even safer process by making sure that you have a flat edge to cut on. And so in that case, what I would do is actually cut this all the way down into half circles so that I had a really flat, stable surface to cut on, and it was a little bit easier. Now you want to make sure that you're using a very clean and sterilized jar for this. And a great way to sterilize this is if you put it in a vat of boiling water. You can sterilize it that way, or you can pour some boiling water into it, and it will sterilize the inside. Fermentation is kind of like a game of competition, and so you want to make sure that any of the bacteria you don't want to grow has the least chance of getting started, and you want to make sure that the bacteria you do want to grow has the best chance of growing. And then competition, they're all going after the same food, which is the sugar and the starch in any vegetable that you're using. So we're just trying to kill off anything that we wouldn't want to grow. I'm going to take a few of these out because with lacto-fermented pickles, we do want there to be a little bit of headroom at the top. So I'm going to try to press these down as much as I can. with my bare hands, and obviously my hands are getting inside. And I washed my hands before we started filming, but you absolutely want to make sure you have very, very clean hands when you're doing all kinds of cooking, and especially so when we're doing something like this. So now that our vinegar has come up just to a light boil, I turned the heat off. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to pour it over my cucumbers and make sure that they're totally submerged. Now, if these jars weren't totally full and the cucumbers were peeking up off the top, what I would want to do is put a small flat surface on top with a small weight to make sure that it was pressing the cucumbers all the way down. Here they're totally submerged, so we're okay. I'm not going to fully tighten the lids on, but I'm just going to cover them with this lid, and I'm not going to put these into the refrigerator. I'm going to keep them at room temperature and until they are completely cool, and after a few days I will test and see how those cucumbers are tasting, and if they're starting to be a little bit tangy, then I will seal them up. So again, with lacto fermentation, it is very important to follow a true recipe, and so you can look online, read a book, or find a recipe somewhere else that you can follow, just because the amount of salt and the size of the container and the different vegetable, they're all conditions that will slightly change exactly how you make these pickles. So now that we've made our quick pickles and our lacto fermented pickles, I'm going to show you how to preserve food by dehydrating it. So for our dehydration, we are going to use apples today. You can use fruit, you can use vegetables, you can even dehydrate meat. Again, you will want to find a recipe for this for what temperature you actually need to set either your dehydrator or your oven for, depending on the food item. We have a dehydrator here that we'll be using today. Some people might have like a countertop dehydrator at home, but you don't need either of those things. You can use your oven set to a low setting. The reason dehydration works to preserve your food is because we're removing water from the food item. Free water is something in a food that will indicate how quickly it might go bad. There's something called water binding, where you can actually add salt or vinegar, or even sugar or starch, and that can bind the water. However, we want to actually remove the water from the food itself. So we're going to be doing that with apples today. So to get started, I'm just going to slice these up thin, and like with the beets and carrots and cucumbers and all these other foods, we're going to keep the skins on for extra nutrition and to reduce our waste. Main part of the apple broken down, I'm going to move that to the side, and I'm going to take these cores and try to get as much of the fruit from this as possible by just removing some of the seeds. You can even see that beautiful star pattern. add flavoring to this on your own, if you want to add a little bit of sugar or lemon or cinnamon, you certainly can. But you don't need to add anything to it if you don't want to. So we're just going to lay these right on our tray and put them in the dehydrator. Now that we've got our apples all laid out on our tray, we're going to put those into the dehydrator for a couple of hours on a nice low heat, about 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the reason that dehydration works is because we're removing a lot of the water from this fruit. And if you're doing this with anything else, the concept is the same. We're removing the water so that it slows down the decay process and really nearly halts it entirely. So once we dehydrate these, they'll be a little bit chewy and very dry and delicious, and they will last for many months at room temperature, just in a sealed container. So let's get these in, and we'll see them in a couple hours. And now that we've finished with all of our food preparation, we can look at what we've made and how much waste is left over. So our full bowl of produce that we started with, this is all that's left. These are the only pieces that we're not able to use. And this we'll be able to put into the compost, but it's a pretty impressively small amount for how much food we started with. So what we were able to make is this delicious roasted vegetable and chickpea medley. So we had our broccoli and the broccoli stems and beets and chickpeas with all these delicious herbs on top. We have the chickpea water that's been foamed and is ready to use as an egg replacement. So I'll be able to make some muffins tonight for breakfast tomorrow morning. We've got our quick pickled onions, which are going to be good in the fridge for at least a month. We have our lemon zest, or lemon peels that can get stored in the freezer until we're ready to use those again. We have 2 pints of lacto-fermented pickles. We have our beet green and beet stalk pesto in this brilliant, beautiful purple color. I'm so excited. It smells so good. We have our full bag of stock scraps that can be stored in the freezer until we're ready to use this, but this will make a full pot of stock. And we have our herbs preserved so that I can use them throughout the whole week. So they're in water and they will last until I'm able to go through all of those. And our apples are dehydrating and they will be ready in just a few hours. And that's everything we've been able to create. And again, really excited to see this full, beautiful bounty and the very small amount of waste that we produced in cooking all of it. Thank you so much for joining our class today, and we hope to see you soon.